So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Walter Rodney Seminar. My name is Eric Schmidt. I'm the Assistant Director here at the BU African Studies Center. Um, it's a pleasure to welcome Tim Weiskell, who's been a visiting researcher here since, I think, March last year, actually. I think he kind of joined us right before things kind of shut down and stuff. So it's good to have you around. Um, Tim graduated from Yale and subsequently trained as a social anthropologist and historian as a Rhodes Scholar at Balliol College in Oxford and at the École pratique des hautes études in Paris. Following fieldwork in West Africa, he received his DPhil from Oxford and returned to the US to teach anthropology and history at Williams College, Yale, and a series of research and teaching positions at Harvard. He's had a long connection to the African Studies Center here at BU. He's actually from Newton, Mass. In 1963, while he was a high school student, he participated in the American Field Service student exchange program in Damascus, Syria. He returned from the experience determined to learn Arabic and focus his work on learning all he could about the dispossessed Palestinian communities that he had come to know while living in Damascus. And in the spring of 1964, a high school history teacher urged him to come along to the weekly seminar series held at the BU African Studies Center back on the corner of Prescott and Lenox Streets. In an effort to introduce him to North African and other Arabic-speaking scholars at BU, who he thought might help Tim get started in Arabic work. And so in spring 1964, Tim attended those weekly seminars, which were sort of what evolved into the Rodney seminars that we know. I think the name change came in 1980 or 1981. But it was during that period that he met Dan McCall, as well as visiting scholars such as Elliot Skinner, Thomas Hodgkin, Ruth Schachter Morgenthau, and Jeffrey Butler, who collectively began to steer his interests towards sub-Saharan Africa. He has a rich array of scholarly activities, including research on French colonial rule in Côte d'Ivoire, environmental ethics and public policy, and sustainability. There are far too many for me to enumerate here, but you can learn more about his work as we will in just a minute. But more recently, he's been working on developing some rich open access resources for African studies available to anyone with a smartphone. In particular, this includes the African Historical Graphics Archive that he launched as an initiative to digitize rare and valuable graphic materials important for the study of African history. In addition, along with fellow Africanist scholars, he has convened the Africa Map Circle to share the online investigation and discussion of African historical cartography. So we'll be learning more about some of these resources today. So Dr. Tim Weiskell, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. And that's right. I've been around for a while, the African Studies Center. What I thought I'd do is go through a few slides to begin with, and then say one or two things that involve judgments. Can you see the slide, the introductory slide saying I'm Tim Weiskell?
Yes.
Okay. Basically, I wanted to indicate that I owe you a lot of thanks at the African Studies Center for the years, because as Eric mentioned, I started in '64 as a senior in Newton High School to come into the seminars that were held mainly in this room on the corner of the Lenox Prescott corner property. It was really quite plush in a way, and it had wood panels, and it made us think it was really quite venerable place to be spending our time. And at the time I met Dan McCall. He provided both the insight and inspiration that attracted many of us, not just me, but a lot of people to become Africanists at the time. I show his book, Africa in Time Perspective, because it was a discussion, as it says, of historical reconstruction from unwritten sources. Now, this was new to me. I was just becoming a historian as a senior in high school. And the idea of doing something from unwritten sources seemed rather novel. But it was published then that same year that I was a senior and started coming to the seminars. So I was fascinated by this and learned very quickly that he was an anthropologist. Although he'd started out as a historian at Columbia, he basically had migrated intellectually to becoming an anthropologist. And he published this thing in a very interesting series of institutions, if you want to call them that. It was a series of lectures that he gave in 1961 at the University of Ghana at the time invited by the provost there at the time. And that was the very first year after well, they became independent in 58, but basically they had set up the university at Legon, and he was one of the first foreign lecturers there. And it then came through a whole series of very interesting programs and was published by the Boston University Press, which was new to me at the time, and the Legon University Press. And moreover, it was distributed worldwide through the University Bookshop in Legon in Accra. And then distributors elsewhere included Oxford University Press, London, Glasgow, New York, Toronto, Melbourne. Okay, I figured the guy had global scope back in 1964, and African studies might be an interesting thing to get into, even though I was focused, as Eric mentioned, on the prospect of trying to learn Arabic and spend more time in Arabic-speaking countries. But what struck me in his book was a particular chapter that he wrote on crops, herds, and people, namely the interaction of the biological with the human in such a way that you could start to learn something about the history of human interaction with the environment. He quoted Collingwood in the beginning of his own book. The historian can rediscover what has been completely forgotten, in the sense that has no statement of it has reached him by an unbroken tradition from eyewitnesses. He can even discover what, until he just discovered it, no one ever knew. This he does partly by the critical treatment of statements contained in his sources, partly by the use of what are called unwritten sources. Now, at the time, this was largely an invitation to look at oral history in Africa. But his chapters included, as I say, that one on crops and animals and herds and the like. But in any case, that's part of how I got, in a sense, tripped into African studies and tricked into African studies by the thinking that was going on between historians and anthropologists about Africa in time perspectives. Other books were published in that same year, 64, that I was a senior at Newton High. And one of them was Political Parties in French-Speaking West Africa by Ruth Shaker Morgenthau. Now, you'll probably remember her as well. She's an amazing scholar in her own right, and got her DPhil at Oxford after working throughout French West Africa on the primary research of the political process in the 1950s. As it turns out, from 1965 onwards, I became interested in the former French colony of the Ivory Coast, partially because I went out in the summer of 65 to work on a field project of Operation Crossroads in a group that was also containing several other high school and college people from the United States, Canada, and Africa, one of whom was Jeannie Hay, who you may well remember at the African Studies Center. She, for a long time, worked in the role of coordinator there at the African Studies Center. I thought I'd take a look briefly at the Ivory Coast and what it looks like, what it means. Basically, the Ivory Coast doesn't have much ivory left in it, but it has a whole lot of coast. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of miles of coast. So we can take a brief look at it if I can figure out how to navigate this in such a way that will give you a sense, in a sense, of the terrain that I worked on and in for several years after 1965. But in particular, I was introduced to it in the summer of 1965. Here we're flying over. Now this is before drones, obviously. So what we're actually in a low altitude Piper Cub, and I'm not in it. This is footage taken from another film, which we'll see more about in a minute. But I want you to observe several things. First of all, it is a coast, obviously. Further, there's no structures on this coast. That is to say, there are no jetties or docks or anything like that moving out in the ocean. And furthermore, there's a very thin layer, we might call it a beachfront here, behind which is something you'll see more about as we fly over it. I'm disconnecting the sound here because it's unrelated, but we'll come back to it in a moment with sound. Now, that's something you should be able to observe very quickly, that within sight of the ocean is fresh water. And what looks like a big puddle here, but in fact, it's a portion of a lagoon, which is separated from the ocean by only this narrow band of inhabited coastline of basically mud huts. And it's that coastline that characterizes the Ivory Coast for hundreds and hundreds of miles, all up and down the coast. In fact, this narration, as we'll hear when I turn on the sound, has an interesting aspect to it. But one of the things you can tell right off the bat is that it's not easy to get in and out of this surf. At the same time, there are reasons why Europeans would want to come ashore here, because there's fresh water. For anybody in a sailing ship, fresh water is it's not so much a commodity as a necessity that anybody has to undertake. And any captain is very aware of where the freshwater sources are. They're looking usually for the ways in which it breaks through to the ocean, and they can get fresh water there in a sailing ship for their crews and the like. But the other thing you got to notice, and is very interesting here, is that people work in groups. You can only see this if you do low-flying aircraft and see something. This is natural because it takes a lot of personnel to get these canoes out over that surf into the ocean. Furthermore, when you build on the coast, you can see that structures eventually emerge, but they're not very sort of impressive in the sense that they have to be set back from the ocean itself, but don't really amount to a whole lot. If we look at the narration that's provided with this film and make some sense of these kinds of structures, it's actually provided by a very famous historian of Africa, Basil Davidson, in a film in 1984 that, thanks to Usman Njai, has been preserved on YouTube for public access. You can look at the links in the talk that I'm giving today to get access to it and watch it. But I've been told by Eric that it's available on film, and maybe even one of the ones we've collected and shared with the rest of the world. But let's see some of his commentary on this. Again, I'll have to share the screen in a way that basically makes it possible for us to hear the sound at this point. I'm going to enable the sound and try to turn up the volume in such a way that we can see it. This is where I could use Ken Burns or someone like his skills to point this out. But let me share that screen and with its sound, give you a sense of his commentary.
Old trading posts like this one had long been the scene of a partnership between maritime traders from Europe and local Africans. By the 1880s, that old partnership was being swept away in a dramatic change, the outcome of a new European drive for overseas empire. Industrialized countries led by France and Britain had begun to invade the Black Continent, each hoping for new sources of raw materials for its factories, new markets for its manufacturers, and new positions of advantage against its rivals. This was called the Scramble for Africa. By 1914, only two countries remained outside European possession, Liberia in the west and Ethiopia in the east. Britain had seized the lion's share of control. Egypt and the Sudan in the north, the immense wealth of South Africa, valuable colonies like Rhodesia and Kenya, and richly populated territories such as Nigeria and the Gold Coast. France had invaded Algeria in the 1830s. Now, after new wars of conquest, she added more colonies to her empire south of the Sahara. including the island of Madagascar. Little Portugal carved out two vast colonies, Angola and Mozambique, while Imperial Germany took the Cameroons and southwest Africa, and on the east coast, Tanganyika. The vast Congo basin fell to King Leopold of the Belgians. Italy and Spain completed the enclosure. The fate of the continent was utterly changed.
Okay, well, the fate of the continent was utterly changed, according to Basil Davidson, and he actually goes on to explain what he means by that in a very powerful summation. I've never seen the carving up of Africa so elegantly put and graphically illustrated as well as that. But let's take a look at his commentary for this as well, because it's quite interesting. And again, I'll have to share a new screen for this, but you'll get the idea.
Between the colonizing powers themselves, the carve-up was peaceful, but their rivalry was intense. In 1884,
Okay, we'll go now to a full screen on that, and you'll see.
Between the colonizing powers themselves, the carve-up was peaceful, but their rivalry was intense. In 1884, a Congress of the competing governments met in Berlin to settle their disputes. Germany's Iron Chancellor Bismarck was there. And active behind the scenes was the ambitious Belgian king. He spoke for them all when he said, "I am determined to get my share of this magnificent African cake." Any power that could occupy African soil could effectively claim it. Now the task was to stake out frontiers in utterly uncharted land. Said the French Prime Minister, "We have embarked on a gigantic steeplechase into the unknown." The British Prime Minister Lord Salisbury was to say of this period, "We've been engaged in drawing lines on maps where no man's foot has ever trod. We've been giving away mountains and rivers and lakes to each other, only hindered by the small impediment that we never knew exactly where we were." The great game was to get hold of places and positions of advantage over rivals, no matter what irrational frontiers might result. One of the most absurd cases was the magnificent Gambia River. Britain had long held Bathurst, Banjul today, and was determined to keep this river route to the interior. But France, invading from the west coast, enclosed all the territory surrounding the Gambia River in her new colony of Senegal. So the French were naturally eager to obtain the Gambia River. They offered Britain, in exchange, the much larger and richer Ivory Coast. But the British Parliament insisted on keeping the Gambia, thus dividing the peoples of the region. And the result was, and is, a country that is 300 miles long, but never more than 30 miles wide. What the African inhabitants might think of this colonial carve-up was never asked. The European idea, in the words of one British governor, was to seize African territory and then, as much as possible, rule the country as if there were no inhabitants. In fact, European contempt for Africans now reached new depths, and no wonder. For how otherwise than by asserting that Africans were helpless children, lazy savages, could Christian Europe justify taking their countries away from them? The helpless children, meanwhile, sang their own version of a famous hymn. Onward, Christian soldiers, into heathen lands, prayer books in your pockets, rifles in your hands. Take the happy tidings where trade can be done. Spread the peaceful gospel with the Gatling gun. The European invasions were widely resisted. Conquest was never easy. And sometimes, as these old drawings and photographs testify, conquest led to a ruthless killing that later generations would prefer to forget. Resistance took many shapes. In French West Africa, a focal point was found in Muslim loyalties. Many heroes, still unforgotten, came on that scene. Some, like the Senegalese religious leader Ahmadou Bamba, offered the way of peace, but were still sent into exile. Others, like the fierce warrior leader Samori, fought off French attack after attack, and was crushed and exiled only after years of war. Death took many, strong or weak. With the skulls of earlier wars displayed in their capital, Kumasi, the powerful Ashanti nation ruled over most of modern Ghana. Led by their kings, who had the title of Asantehene, they'd long defended their country against Britain, but now they desperately wanted a peaceful settlement.
In 1895, fearing a disastrous war with Britain, King Prempeh made a strong bid for peace from his palace here at Kumasi. He offered the British the right to establish in Ashanti a chartered company with all the concessions, the privilege that such a company could possibly desire. But it wasn't enough, for the British now wanted territorial possession as well as privilege.
The Ashanti nation had already fought long, hard battles against the British. But this time, in 1896, they decided to surrender. In a ceremony of deliberate humiliation, the king was made to kiss the British commander's boot and then sent into exile.
But it wasn't the end of the story. The British now blundered. A new British governor, Sir Frederick Hodgson, decided that he had to get possession of the sacred golden stool, symbol of the Ashanti nation's soul. Arriving at the British fort here in Kumasi, he ordered the assembled chiefs to hand the stool over. Worse still, he demanded the right to sit on it, something that no person had ever been allowed to do, not even the king himself.
To Hodgson's final insult, the Ashanti replied with war. This little fort in Kumasi is what the British had built, just in case, and now they sorely needed it. The few dozen British inmates of the fort were besieged for months and had to eat rats to stay alive.
Hodgson's act of folly had exacted a bitter price. Efforts to send in relief from the coast were repeatedly frustrated by Ashanti resistance, until finally the governor and his wife got away to the coast and the absurd but tragic affair could be closed. This ended war between Britain and Ashanti, and a year later, in 1901, the British quietly annexed the country, which became part of the colony of the Gold Coast.